Hello, and welcome to another deep dive into the intriguing, lesser-known aspects of history. Today, we're exploring a fascinating, often overlooked topic: medieval drug culture. When we think of the Middle Ages, we usually imagine knights, castles, and crusades, but there's an entire world beneath the surface we rarely discuss. What about the potions, tonics, and elixirs people were using? The medieval world had its own complex relationship with substances that could either heal or harm. Today, we're going to uncover the secrets of addiction in the medieval era. From medicinal remedies to the darker, more dangerous side of intoxication, you'll learn how people sought relief, escape, and even spiritual enlightenment through various substances. We'll also examine the social and religious implications of drug use, the role of apothecaries, and how these practices still echo in modern culture. Stick around, because this is one history lesson you won't want to miss. Before we jump in, if you enjoy deep dives like this, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more, and leave a comment below telling us what city you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Medicinal Beginnings. Picture an infirmary at dawn. Smoke from last night's rushlight hangs in a thin ribbon. A mortar holds a ring of green around its lip. On the sill, a row of clay jars leans like parishioners: poppy, henbane, rue, sage, each labelled in a careful hand. A monk has already walked the physic garden, fingers numbed by dew, clipping seed heads into a wicker basket. Before the first bell, he warms wine into syrup, grinds resin and dried petals, murmurs the names of God and physicians in the same breath, and carries a soporific draught to an old tenant whose hip aches when the weather turns. Here, the Middle Ages look less like a parade of banners and more like most lives actually felt. Pain, work, worry, managed with plants, prayers, recipes copied from books older than memory. Medicine begins in this world with balance. Bodies, like seasons and foods, have qualities: hot, cold, dry, moist, that ought to sit in proportion. The four humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, colour not only skin and stools but temperaments, moods, impulses. To heal is to nudge a tilted person back to centre. Substances have natures too. Pepper warms, lettuce cools, vinegar dries, honey moistens. At the far ends stand the dangerous helpers, plants and resins judged in the fourth degree, powerful enough to knock a body back toward harmony or straight out of consciousness. Opium, cold and dry in the fourth, is presented in learned manuals as a substance that can still agony and still breath. Medieval readers encounter it through the Latinized voices of Dioscorides and Galen, and, arriving from the east by way of translators in Sicily and Spain, Avicenna's Canon of Medicine. The tone is cool, precise. Opium can relieve pain, halt cough, induce sleep. Dose with care. Let prudence sit at your elbow. It is good advice that becomes harder to keep as suffering sharpens in a room. The people who ask for sleep are specific. A ploughman, whose spine has stiffened from sacks of malt lifted for 30 winters. A mother, whose fever clings after childbirth. A pilgrim with an ulcer at the ankle that reduces the world to 2 purple inches of skin. None has a word like addiction. They have sins, gluttony, drunkenness, and bad habits. If something exerts a pull, it is described as desire, weakness, softness. Yet the experience of chasing relief and finding it briefly in a cup, then thinking of that cup sooner next time, already exists. Not as a diagnosis, but as a household pattern. A new errand, a drawer that gets opened more often, a priest who asks pointed Lenten questions about drink and stupefaction. Recipes are acts of touch and time. Crush, sift, macerate, steep. One mistake means more than an off flavor. Drought changes the strength of a harvest. A jar set too near the hearth concentrates while nobody watches. The measures tempt drift, scruples, drams, grains, tiny weights in calloused hands in failing light. Surgeons circulate the soporiferous sponge, opium with mandrake, henbane, perhaps a splash of hemlock, held like a craft secret that turns cries into silence long enough to saw and sow. How often was it used? How well did it work? The records quarrel. The desire that produced it does not. People wanted mercy from pain and were willing to risk the edge where mercy becomes risk itself. Walk the garden that feeds the still room. Poppy heads bleed white tears in summer. Dried, their seeds rattle like rain in a gourd. Mandrake, with its split root that resembles a pair of legs, anchors jokes and recipes alike, screaming in folklore when pulled, lending deeper sleep in practice for tooth extractions and dislocations. Henbane's velvet leaves offer relief and peril together. Too strong a cup, and the speech slurs. Visions enter by a side door. Belladonna gleams more often in Italy than in the north, but the lesson is the same. Beauty and danger in one stem. Cunning women and midwives know these plants in a way the law half trusts. They come when the pain is a woman's, the hour awkward, the priest unavailable. Sometimes their work looks ordinary. A string steeped in poppy and honey slipped against a rotten tooth. A compress for cramp. A steam for creaking lungs. Sometimes it shades toward the forbidden. An infusion brewed stronger than a husband expects, or a draught offered with a warning that sounds like a dare. Only a thimble, sister, no more. In towns, medicine wears an apron and keeps hours. The apothecary's shop is a place of smells: vinegar, pine pitch, cumin, the faint animal ghost of musk. Jars line the walls. A ledger in the back records prices in thornprick strokes. Here, remedy becomes transaction. Opium and its cousins do not grow locally once winter sets in. They arrive folded into bales beside spices and dyestuffs, declared imports, taxed by officers who pretend they can tell cinnamon from cassia by scent. Physicians trained at Salerno or Montpellier write prescriptions. Apothecaries fulfill them, and both work from a mental atlas that reaches from Sicily to Syria. Theriac, the celebrity compound with scores of ingredients, opium among them, takes center stage. Kneaded, aged, stamped, sometimes tested in public, it is medicine and theatre alike, a symbol of safety you can swallow if you can afford it. City fathers occasionally stage demonstrations. A dog supposedly snake-bitten and then dosed. Men with hourglasses watching, citizens murmuring their faith or doubt. Whether such trials prove anything pharmacologically is questionable. What they certainly prove is desire, for a story of mastery in a world thick with hazard. Most people do not live at Theriac's price point. Their pharmacopoeia is made of smaller gestures, a posset of hot milk and ale, a spoon of syrup, a pillow stuffed with lavender to nudge sleeplessness toward the edge of morning. Alcohol is solvent and companion both. Wine and ale carry plants that otherwise taste like a burnt stick. They add their own warmth. The difference between a sleeping draught and a nightcap can shrink to the thickness of a breath. If a bitter brew quiets a farmer's back, does he return for the herb, or the way the brew unhooks his shoulders? Both. In a world where labor measures worth, relief is a kind of currency. People spend it without always asking which mint struck the coin. Inside monasteries, a small, serious drama plays itself to repetition. Dulling a dying person's pain is mercy. Clouding the mind so that confession falters is peril. How much poppy is kindness? How much crosses the line into negligence? The answers vary with house and abbot, with the imagined weight of the dying man's sins. But the questions mark the first steps of an ethics of intoxication, practical, nervous, carried more in faces than in texts. A ledger tracks purchases, a conscience tracks souls. The texts, nonetheless, are busy. The Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, that jaunty poem of hygiene, chirps about moderation, early rising, balanced humours. Learned physicians quote Galen with confidence and Avicenna with mounting frequency. In their pages, the strongest substances acquire a special grammar, qualifiers, cautions, degrees. Use when gentler remedies fail. Administer with care, for robust bodies only. Without neurotransmitters or the vocabulary of dependency, medieval medicine still articulates a basic truth. Potent relief is perilous relief. The drug that solves one problem tends to draft a second. Constipation, vertigo, nightmares, a chill that lingers in bone. Where there is a pendulum, swing belongs to the design. Households fill the space between scholastic counsel and expensive compounds. Imagine 2 jars on a shelf, one mild, chamomile, balm, hops, and one wicked, whose name came with a cousin's oath when a tooth died by slow degrees. The wicked jar does not travel often. It appears when endurance runs out. If it works, a story grows around it. Neighbours learn the name. A cousin sends a cousin. A pattern forms. For that sort of pain, go to that sort of house. If you think addiction is a modern invention, consider this. Your best sleep of the year sits corked in the next room, and you know exactly how to get more. You lack a word that condemns your own reaching, because the first spoon came as charity. What you do have is a confessor who asks, in spring, whether you have sought forgetfulness as often as you have sought God. The most revealing scene is minor, a tooth pulled in a kitchen. The patient braces on a stool, head held to a doorframe, a strap of leather between molars. The operator, rarely a surgeon, more often a neighbour with nerve, pinches iron around enamel, twists, hopes the route is short. Before the wrench, the patient swallows a cup of something hot and dark, not to grant oblivion, to push the moment 2 feet away. If the cup is stronger next time, nobody writes it down. If a night arrives with no tooth to pull but a thirst for that distance, that too escapes the record. What remains is the habit of reaching for something that shortens a night, and the uneasy knowledge that each good sleep stretches the next bad one. Scholars like to emphasize continuities. The ancient books, the Arabic translations, the Mediterranean circuits that kept Europe stitched to older learning. Fair enough. But texture lies where repetition lives. The aches that come with winter, the risks of childbirth every month, knives that keep dulling, the ordinary catastrophes of poorly mended bones. Against that stubborn background, people discover small levers that shift sensation. Opium is one, henbane another, stronger wine on Fridays a third. The moral machine does not perfectly map onto these levers. Drunkenness is sin. A prescribed ale laced with poppy might sit, honestly, in one mind, halfway to medicine. A draught before a dangerous journey can belong to prudence. Slide the frame, and the same cup passes from vice to virtue and back. Gender and status decide who holds which lever. Noble houses stock theriac and spices. A baron's wife keeps recipes in a hand-copied book. Rose pastilles for swooning, clove syrups for cough, a poppy jelly for restless nights. Elsewhere, the kit is thinner but not simpler. Knowledge condenses around a few plants, and those become both helpers and hazards. Women's expertise, stubborn, resilient, passed from aunt to niece, keeps households from snapping under strain. That same expertise draws suspicion when the turn goes wrong. If a sedative ends in stupor too deep, Rumour takes the reins. Which does the explanatory work that overdose would do now? The stakes of opening the right jar, of being the person who knows, are never merely botanical. Language about compulsion lives in other neighbourhoods. Monks write about acedia, the noonday heaviness that pins a man to his bench. Preachers warn against softness, the habit of avoiding hardship. Physicians describe habitus, the way bodies settle into patterns. None of these meshes with a modern clinical frame, but all circle a truth. People can come to need certain states and dread their absence. A night without sleep feels like moral failure and bodily risk at once. A day without a small cup of warmth doubles labour's weight. If the chemical sketch is missing, the social one is not. Who sanctions the cup? Who sells it? Who frowns from the doorway? Who pays? One object stands for the whole dilemma: the spoon. It measures and it blesses. A child learns to open, swallow, trust the hand that holds it. Adults relearn the gesture when pain lowers them to helplessness. If relief is liquid, the spoon is the line between dose and indulgence. Just a spoon, we say even now, when caution is invited but desire is admitted. Medieval spoons carry honeyed syrups and bitter infusions. They also carry bargaining. Just a spoon, brother, and you'll be strong enough for prime. Just a spoon, husband, and you won't wake the house. The promise that what is measured is safe is as old as kitchens, and sometimes just as false. By the later Middle Ages, the lanes between theory, shop, and bedside are worn as cart ruts. University physicians prescribe and rarely compound. Apothecaries compound and often advise. Surgeons cut and mix their own stupefactions. In the countryside, one person may do all three and pray. What holds the system together is not agreement, but need. People need to go on. Pain makes going on harder. Some plants make it easier. Some of those plants invite repeated use. All of this can be true without the word addiction. You do not need a term to suffer its referent. If the chapter seeks a verdict, it is this tempered one. Medieval people understood power and peril knotted together in strong substances. They built fences from rules and rituals, market regulations, confessional questions, margins annotated with "Beware the stupefying cold." They also leaned on the ordinary grace of neighbours who slipped a jar into your hands when your eyes were red at the edges. Between poison and medicine, the difference is a syllable: dose. Between a night rescued and a habit begun, the distance can be measured on the bowl of a spoon. Outside the infirmary, the street rolls into day. A bell wakes bakers, mules clatter. A shopkeeper unbars shutters and sets his scales on the counter. The mortar waits for its next handful of leaves. The ledger waits for its next line. Follow the chain from garden to bedside to shop, and you cross the link that will dominate our next hour. The moment when medicine becomes trade, when suffering meets a set price, when knowledge wears a merchant's apron. The apothecary's doorway is open. Jars glow like stained glass in the morning sun. Step closer. The labels resolve into names both familiar and dark. Here, in the calibrated clink of weights and the practiced turn of the pestle, relief acquires a cost, and sometimes a bill that keeps arriving. Chapter 2. The Dark Side of Apothecaries. Step past the threshold and the street thins to a chord of smells. Vinegar and pine pitch, rosewater and rancid fat, a sweet dull note that might be opium or just sugar warmed too long. Shelves climb the walls in regimented colour. Greenish glass, brown earthenware, white tin-glazed jars painted with herb names in looping hands. It is tidy, reputable, comforting, until you learn to read the room the way a city inspector reads it. Then every instrument has a shadow. The scales, which should kiss equilibrium, can be filed to favour the house. The weights can be shaved by a whisper. The pestle can bully delicate seeds into dust that hides sand. The apothecary is part healer, part merchant, part stage magician, and none of those roles is immune to the oldest temptation, to turn suffering into margin. Cities knew it. By the 12th and 13th centuries, councils posted lists of allowable prices and issued ordinances on what could be sold, how fresh, and in what strength. Venice demanded that theriac, the star antidote of the age, a paste of dozens of ingredients bound with honey, be compounded publicly, under watchful clerical and civic eyes, aged and stamped. Florence wrapped apothecaries together with physicians into a guild, the Arte dei Medici e Speciali, binding them to rules but also to prestige. Paris sent sergeants to check measures and to smell out rancid fats or stale spices. The impulse was not moral panic, it was municipal housekeeping. If your city depends on 1,000 tiny shops to keep bodies going, you cannot afford to let too many of them cheat. Cheating had its grammar. Saffron, more valuable than some metals, could be stretched with marigold petals or wetted to add weight. Bad saffron meant fevers that didn't break. Peppercorns could hide pebbles. Cassia could stand in for cinnamon and fool only the inattentive or the poor. Sugar, medicine as well as sweet, could be cut with ground chalk. Syrups could be freshened with a drown of strong wine. Even honest hands faced pressures. A storm ruined a year's crop. A caravan arrived lean. The poor kept asking on credit recorded in a ledger that already bit its own tail. And then there were the substances whose very power tempted doctors and patients to overreach. Opium, henbane, belladonna, arsenic and its cousins kept under the counter in labelled threat. A city could regulate, but it could not wish away the tug of war between care and cash. Theriac sits at the centre of this stage, like a crowned actor. In the apothecary's telling, it is the very emblem of order, theory made edible, the Mediterranean's best knowledge kneaded into a safe paste, a bulwark against snakebite, plague, poison, melancholy. In the critic's telling, it is theatre, opium and honey and faith, sold dear and dosed vague, a comfort to the wealthy who feared secret knives. Both stories are true enough. Councilmen attended compounding ceremonies, physicians signed off, customers paid a season's wages for a jar, and behind that ritual lay a simpler scene. A sick child, a frightened parent, and a spoon. If the paste settled a cough, theriac earned its keep. If it calmed pain and gave 4 hours sleep, it was loved. And if love turned to reliance, there were few breaks in the system to slow the hand that reached back to the jar. The line where healing ends and habit begins is not a medieval invention, but the shop sharpened it. Apothecaries sold not just cures, but experiences, a softened throat, a gentle gut, a duskier room inside the skull. Stronger preparations made better stories, so long as they did not spill into scandal. The customer who complained of wind received fennel and anise. The one who complained of black thoughts might leave with a syrup whose recipe walked nearer to sleep. There are sermons and handbooks that scold apothecaries by name for stupefying the faithful before confession or mass. There are also accountants' books that show steady lines of small purchases that look, if you squint like a social historian, like the beginnings of regular dosing. The truth sits between. Pain pressed the poor into small risks. Money let the wealthy turn those risks into habits disguised by Latin labels. At the counter, ethics became practical. A widow came in with coins so thin they winked. An apprentice saw the sores on her hands and cut the price by instinct, then got his ear tugged by his master when she left. A guild regulation forbade selling certain poisons without a physician's order. A regular customer begged a little arsenic to deal with rats, and every adult in the room knew the word had two meanings. The shopkeeper's wife, often as knowledgeable and decisive as her husband, moved between charity and caution with a gambler's poise. Widows sometimes ran these shops after their husbands died, and their names appear in court records when a sale went wrong. Too strong a purge, a sleeping draught given to a man with a weak heart, an argument with a neighbour who thought her child had been bewitched by a bottle with a church Latin label. To accuse a woman was often easier than to examine the recipe, and the line between apothecarian and poisoner could be a rumour wide. The fear of poison thickened in courts and chronicles as politics sharpened. Ars in the mortar could mean an inheritance arranged, a rival thinned, a tyrant toppled, so chroniclers like to imagine. Much of this is rumour wearing perfume. Some of it is law. City statutes list venena with a gravity that outlives fads. Arsenic, orpiment, realgar, aconite. You could sell them under rules that read like a cold voice at your ear. Doses minimal, purpose clear, physician's seal required. Or you could stand in front of a magistrate. But power warps rules. A prince's household could buy what it liked. A political enemy could find laws applied with zeal. The apothecary stood dangerously near both poles, useful to the high, visible to the angry. Then plague. When the Black Death came, the demand for anything that promised a cone of safety turned frantic. Posies, pomanders, spiced vinegars, syrups, theriac, unicorn horn shavings, bone-powdered and baptized with fantasy, all moved across counters like water carried in sieves. Prices spiked. City fathers posted ceilings. Guilds repeated their oldest promises about purity and measure. Some shops grew rich. Others were shuttered when the plague took the whole household. The moralists wrote as moralists do. The rich have turned fear into an occasion for gluttony. The poor, denied even false comforts, die badly. There is justice in that anger, and also the ordinary truth that panic distorts judgment. Apothecaries caught the wave because they were the wave. The only game left when physicians fled and priests ran out of breath. Trust requires theatre as much as it requires chemistry. Public inspections were performative by design. Wooden chests were opened like reliquaries. Master apothecaries named the ingredients in recipes from memory. Physicians prodded pastes and pretended to know by smell whether cinnamon hailed from Ceylon or some lesser grove. You can call that empty ritual, but ritual is how laypeople measure seriousness. If the city shows up to smell the jars, someone is minding the store. Yet that same theatre lets bad habits hide. A stamped seal on theriac tells you the batch was made under supervision. It does not tell you who will be brave or lazy with the spoon at 2 a.m. Another dark seam runs between apothecaries and painters, dyers, metalworkers, the colourists of the Middle Ages. Pigments and poisons share shelves. Verdigris and orpiment gleam, and they are not good for a body. Mercury sits ready to cure skin ailments and to silver a mirror. Lead glows innocently in white powders that smooth the face and hasten harm. The guild in Florence that yokes physicians, apothecaries, and painters together makes practical sense. They all buy and grind and mix. They all trust what the pestle reveals. It also means the shop is a doorway to a world where health and hazard use the same toolkit. If your face cream shares a shelf with a rat poison, the virtue of labels becomes a matter of life. Religion threads through all of this without settling it. Confessional manuals accuse apothecaries of avarice, of selling false comfort, of keeping Sunday hours when they should be at Mass. saints' lives praise those who give medicine freely, and the same pages mutter against those who cheat weights. Monasteries complain about urban shops that lure lay brothers with better syrups. Urban shops mock monastic recipes as old country. A quiet, honest apothecary might be the parish's pride, a showy one the priest's steady sermon fodder. The system runs on reputation and on fear, and those forces rarely pull in the same direction. Diversity in the trade made cities stronger and angrier by turns. In Iberian towns under Muslim rule, Jewish and Muslim apothecaries worked alongside Christians. Their books flowed through the same hands that moved spices, and their remedies carried the scholarship of Cairo and Damascus into places that needed it. Maimonides, physician in 12th century Cairo, wrote on poisons and antidotes with a clarity that still feels like a handrail. Those ideas travelled. The same shops that embodied cosmopolitan skill also became targets when famine or plague made neighbours want culprits. Riots break shops more easily than theories. Look closely at the ledger, a day's worth of sales in a smaller city, and you can hear the creak of social machinery. Names repeat. A cobbler's apprentice who buys pennyworths of a cough syrup 3 days running. A brewer's wife who buys the cordial water before each market day. A clerk who buys theriac on credit that is never quite cleared. Credit as such is not a sin, but dependency loves credit. It smooths the shame of returning and disguises the cost until the week the apothecary says no. Out front, the talk is always about ailments. In the book, the talk is about patterns. Regulators were not blind to patterns. Ordinances tried to put distance between apothecaries and taverns, and not only because of fire risk. If you could step out of a shop with a bottle of poppy syrup and step into a room where wine did the rest of the work, temptation arranged itself on the pavement. Some councils banned hot wines infused with narcotic herbs. Others licensed them under the pretense of winter health. Lines were drawn, rubbed out, redrawn. Proof that the thing being policed was not a substance, but a habit of reaching. The shop sold the pretext. The tavern sold the second act. Charms and science shared jars more often than either would admit. An apothecary might tuck a written prayer under a lid for a customer who would not trust anything less than heaven. He might, with a wink, sell a sachet of dried flowers called St. John's hand to hang above a cradle. He might mutter against superstition and then align his own compounding day with a favourable star. None of this cancels the genuine learning in the room, the dosage cautions copied from Avicenna, the bitter knowledge of what a purge can do to a frail old man. It simply reveals that medicine on a street corner is never purely a science. It is an exchange between fear and promise, with coin in the middle. If you want an emblem for the shop's temptations, look again at the scales. On one tray, a relief so real you can feel it under your tongue. On the other, time without pain, time made usable, time bought in spoons. It is hard to accuse a man who sells you time, and easy for that man to convince himself that a small tilt in the weights is a service. The first injustice the scales commit is usually against the apothecary's own conscience. The second is against the poorest who come through the door. And still, visit at closing, and you may find the master washing a small boy's cut with warm wine, refusing money from a mother who has none, sending an apprentice out with a parcel for a bedridden neighbour. The trade's darkness lives alongside its decency. The city needs the shop the way a body needs salt. It simply cannot salt the broth so strongly that the tongue forgets the taste of water. Rules, seals, sermons, inspections. They do not cure the temptation to turn care into profit, but they keep that temptation visible enough to argue with. We leave as customers arrive. A man in a mason's hood who coughs as though his chest were a broken bell. A girl with a swollen thumb hard as a nut. A clerk who insists he needs only something for wakeful nights before copying. The clerk will be advised a gentler syrup. He will ask, flushed and cheerful, for the one with the stronger sleep. Outside, the street exhales into noise. Across the lane, a tavern door yawns and shows the red interior of a winter afternoon. Spice wines steam, ale foams. A pitcher goes down a table like a vow. The apothecary sells draughts by prescription and story. The tavern sells them by the pint and the song. Between the two, a city keeps its balance, or doesn't. Our next step crosses that hinge. From jars to jugs, from labelled comfort to the cup you don't measure because everyone is drinking. Chapter 3. Alcohol in the Middle Ages, more than just a drink. Step out of the apothecary and the street hands you the other pharmacy. A door painted red, a bunch of evergreens nailed above the lintel, the familiar triangle of ale stakes jutting like antlers to say, "Drink here." Inside fire and steam and breath. A bench glossed by elbows, jugs with bellies like geese. If the shop sold relief by the spoon, this room sells it by the pint. And also wages, gossip, credit, songs, quarrels, and the gentle courage needed to cross a winter. Medieval alcohol was a tool, a tax base, a medicine, a food. It was also sometimes a trap. Begin with a correction. It is easy to say people drank because water was unsafe, and easier still to let that line do all the thinking. Wells, springs and fast streams could yield perfectly good water. Monasteries prized clean sources. Towns sunk public wells and guarded them with bylaws. But fermentation made sense for other reasons. Ale and wine carried calories, travelled better than water, and, especially in cities where waste and work pressed close, were often the more reliable daily liquid. Small beer, or small ale, low in alcohol, went down at breakfast without rearranging the day. Stronger batches were for paydays, saints' days, shock, or celebration. A medieval table might see a child sip small beer and a grandparent sip warmed wine, and nobody would blink. The geography shaped the pint. South of the Loire and across the Mediterranean rim, vines meant wine. Reds and rosés from Languedoc and Gascony, white wines along the Rhine and Moselle, the sweet and the sharp moving in casks where roads and rivers allowed. Monasteries disciplined vineyards into order. Cistercians wrote as carefully about slopes and soils as they did about psalms. In the north and northeast, barley and oats held sway. Ale was the home drink and the town drink both. In England, ale, for centuries, meant unhopped, flavoured and preserved with gruit, a mix of herbs sold or licensed by lords and towns. Beer, hop-bitten and longer keeping, pushed in from the Low Countries late in the Middle Ages, and met suspicion. Hops tasted medicinal and foreign to some, Lutheran and low to others. They also let brewers ship farther and keep longer, and the economy has a way of out-arguing palate and prejudice. Brewing sat first in kitchens. Women brewed as part of household work, mashing grain, stirring kettles, skimming froth, testing by scent and ear the moment a boil had done its duty. A good housewife's ale kept a family from flagging and brought neighbours to the back door with coins. When production scaled up, it did so along that same gendered seam. Brewsters and alewives running small commercial batches, their names recorded in court rolls when a measure ran short or a strength disappointed. Later, as capital concentrated and equipment got heavier, men increasingly took the trade. Badges and signs told walkers what awaited within. So did the smell of hot wort on a lane, a smell that made a workday feel, for a minute, like a feast. Towns kept a sharp nose. The assize of bread and ale in England set prices and standards from the 13th century, adjusting a penny's worth to grain supply. Ale tasters, ale conners in London, were sworn officers who wandered from house to house, dipping ladles, judging strength, checking measures, fining those who watered or fooled. In theory, the system guaranteed fairness. In practice, it created stories. Everyone knew who liked bribes, who punished short jacks, small pitchers, with theatrical severity, who could be charmed with a free round. The point is not the comedy, but the constant civic attention. If your population runs on liquid grain, you regulate it with the intimacy you reserve for bread. Inns, alehouses, taverns. The words mattered. An inn promised beds and stabling. A tavern dealt in wine. An alehouse dealt in ale and company. All three overlapped shamelessly. What distinguished them was often clientele and credit. Merchants and clerks tilted toward taverns, where jugs of Gascon claret, the English name for the light red wines they imported while they held Bordeaux, stained the lips, and bills could be settled after the fair. Labourers and craftfolk installed themselves on alehouse benches close to home, where the talk concerned timber, fish and rents, and the pot was shared like a loaf. Inns gathered travellers into temporary fellowship, pilgrims with cockle shells, drovers with the smell of animals folded into their coats, harpers, dice throwers, night squires with news. Alcohol funded religion by the back door. Church ales, parish fundraisers with brewing and feasting attached, paid for roofs and candles. Bride ales and lamb ales and leat ales turned occasions into economies. The church scolded drunks from the pulpit on Sunday and sold hot spiced wine at the porch on feast days. Contradiction or compromise, it kept the roof on. Monasteries wrote rules about drink and then brewed with thoroughness that looked, to outsiders, like indulgence. Yet the brewing hours and the ledgers read like care. 1 week ale for daily use, 1 stronger for guests, a dark malty batch for harvest crews and for monks ill or old. Fasting rules that forbade meat and sometimes milk said nothing about ale. A body could carry a day's labour on liquid bread. Work tethered drinking to the clock. Harvest labourers received ale as part of the wage. Mugs carried through fields, encouraging swing in scythe and rhythm in rake. Carpenters and masons took a draught mid-morning and mid-afternoon, the way we use coffee. City records set limits to keep a workday from dissolving. Guilds regulated masters who paid with intoxicants rather than coin. They also scheduled feasts where the same substance cemented belonging. A young apprentice learned to hold his ale and his tongue at the same time, a skill as professional as any measure he learned on a bench. For the poor, alcohol was also calories, warmth, and a hedge against thin soups. In winter, a mug of hot ale sugared with a pinch of spice made a night survivable. A woman who had bled at childbed took possets, milk curdled with ale or wine and strained, until her strength returned. A man with a rasping cough took warmed wine with hyssop or licorice from the apothecary across the way. Lines blur here. Is it food, medicine, or a quiet trip away from pain? The answer changes by hour. None of this gentles the sin. Ebrietas, drunkenness, fills penitential manuals and sermons. It has company, dice, brawls, fornication, but it often leads the parade. Preachers teach the ladder, a cup for cheer, a second for loosening, a third for folly, the fourth for shame. Confessors ask, were you drunk? Did you miss mass? Did you strike? Did you ruin your household's peace? The law joins in. Stocks, fines, scoldings before the manor court. Women as well as men find their names entered when ale collides with temper. A husband who drinks away a week's wage does not yet carry a diagnosis. He carries a reputation and a family that recalculates. Even a parish that depends on ale to raise the knave will mutter about households ruined by the same cup. The literature hears all of this and smiles crookedly. A poet puts the personified vices in an alehouse. A pilgrim's tale in a tavern ends in a moral blacker than the wine. You can almost smell the room. Sour wood, smoke, iron on the tongue. That smile matters because it shows how ordinary intoxication is. It also shows how constantly medieval people thought about management. Nobody imagined a town without drink. Many imagined a life without disgrace. Between those poles lived custom, and custom is just the town's memory of where it has hurt itself. Technically, the liquids divide and multiply. Wine could be doctored into hypocras, strained with sugar and spices into a sweet medicinal finish for grand tables, or mulled for winter. Ale might be drunk new, green and sharp, or conditioned a little, or, if hops were used, kept in cask for real time. Cider and perry ran like small rivers in regions of apples and pears, quieter in the record because they travelled poorly, faithful to their valleys. Distillation enters late, shyly. Aquavitae, water of life, a clear spirit preached by physicians as medicine for the old or the chilled, administered by drops. Only in the centuries to come would spirits stride out of the still room and into the street with a swagger. Logistics gave alcohol political teeth. To hold Bordeaux meant to hold a source of revenue, to keep English taverns flushed with claret and merchants busy moving casks. Wars moved more on wine than songs admit. Armies could not trust water in carts for long marches. Ale and wine south of the Alps, beer north, kept feet moving and mutinies at bay. Quartermasters cursed leaky barrels more than they cursed enemies. Coopers, the barrel makers, stood as silent allies of kings. A town that could brew well could feed masons, soldiers, and strangers. A harvest that failed could be softened with imports only if roads worked and tolls did not strangle. Alehouses doubled as hiring halls and newsrooms. A mason looking for work listened for names at a bench. A reeve looking for men to mend a bridge set a jug down and let volunteers accumulate. News ran along these benches faster than proclamations. Attacks rumoured, a ship wrecked, a saint's bone displayed at the next town over. You drank to warm yourself, and you drank to belong. In that warmth and belonging lived a second danger less visible than the fistfight. Habit stitched to community. If every promise is sealed with a round, if every grief is answered with one more, the man who declines becomes a problem for the bench. Some did, stubbornly. Many learned the art of the half measure and the slow sip. Women's faces show at the threshold in 3 roles: brewers, servers, patrons. A widow keeps an alehouse to keep her children. The court chides her for short measure and warns her away from harbouring gamblers. A servant girl comes in on a Sunday with friends and is, in a flash, the subject of 3 kinds of attention: friendly, predatory, pastoral. A merchant's wife sits at the edge with a cup of spiced wine and a look that says she knows exactly the lines she won't cross and the reasons she's here anyway. To write alcohol into men's bodies alone is to miss half the room and most of the economy. Measure governed the moral arithmetic. Jacks, pottles, quarts, gallons. The wooden and pewter containers that made a trade possible also made cheating possible. Inspectors tested not only strength but size. False measures crowd the margins of town records. In places, ale was carried in tofts and yards by walking sellers. In others, the law required drinking on premises to keep an eye on behaviour. Music and games sharpened distinctions. You could sing here and not there. You could play tables, backgammon, but not hazard, dice, on weekdays. You could borrow a lute and be welcome if you brought it back. Alcohol drew law like iron draws filings because it drew people into rooms where they made choices together. Set beside the bench, the cup that belongs to the altar. Wine for mass had to be wine, no substitutes. And so vineyards and trade lines bent gently around the needs of parishes. The same liquid that warmed hands in a tavern poured into a chalice, transfigured by words. It is no accident that preachers reached for drink as metaphor. Sober, drunk, filled with new wine, watchful, awake. The religious life did not sit outside the drinking life. It braided it, licensed it, rebuked it, sanctified a small measured draught and worried about the next two. If the apothecary sold consolation in Latin, the church sold it too, with a more demanding aftertaste. At day's end, a man closes his eyes and remembers the taste of the day, the sour of new ale, the resin of a hopped beer he swore he disliked, and now admits he might try again, the sweetness of a winter wine that felt like a hearth. He tells himself he is not the kind who drinks to forget. He tells himself he is the kind who drinks to belong, to warm, to reward a shoulder that carried bricks. He is both kinds on different days. Medieval people knew that, and they wrote the knowledge into rules and stories rather than diagnoses. The bench remembers who wobbled, who sang, who paid. The ledger remembers who comes back too often for the stronger stuff. The confessional remembers who keeps promising to keep the second cup for feast days. We have moved from jars to jugs, from labelled doses to measures judged by eye and acquaintance. The liquid that united workshops, parishes and armies also produced the same old intimate wreckage. A pawned cloak, a squandered wage, a bruise someone explained as a fall. Yet to imagine a Middle Ages without drink is to imagine a Europe without glue. The question, for them as for us, was never drink or not, but how much, when, and to what end. And that last question, to what end, turns us toward the chapter behind the church door, where wine is not a comfort but a sacrament, where fumes and smoke mean more than pleasure, and where the search for ecstasy risks sliding from vision into heresy. Chapter 4. The use of drugs in religious ceremonies. Leave the bench where jugs are sermons and step through a different door. The same wine that last hour warmed hands now stands in a chalice polished thin by centuries. The same smoke that hung in tavern rafters here rises from a thurible in swinging arcs, a measured weather of scent. We have not escaped intoxication so much as placed it under rule. A church teaches with disciplines the alehouse knows only as custom. Fasting, a cup measured by rubric, smoke burned on schedule, songs that harness breath. If the tavern lent courage to face the weak, the liturgy lends shape to it, and shape has a power all its own. Medieval people understood that the path to the heart runs through the senses. They did not need modern vocabulary, neurotransmitters, psychoactive, to know that the smell of resin, the gleam of wine, and the hum of chant could tilt a room's interior weather. Begin with the simple fact. Wine in the West is a sacrament. Its holiness is not a metaphor. Priests argued over words, substance, accidents, while lay people learned the steadier lesson that a small draught could bear an infinite meaning. The cup at the altar is modest, the sip deliberate. Intoxication is not the point. Yet all the scaffolding around that sip, the fast beforehand, the thinness that comes with vigils, the heightened expectation of feast days, prepares a body to feel lightly altered by very little. When a priest whispers and lifts, silence does part. When he drinks, some worshippers feel their own throats work, a ghost swallow. Altar wine travels in quiet circuits of trade. bought with care because doctrine requires grape, not substitutes. It is ordinary in its chemistry and extraordinary in its use, a reminder that context can turn a food into a key. Smoke sets the second stage. Incense is not a prop, it is a theology that smells. Frankincense and myrrh arrive in lumps, hard as amber, in cloth bundles stamped with distant hands. Charcoal glows, a spoon feeds resin to fire, and suddenly the nave has a cloud. You can measure the effect by eye, people straighten, and by ear, voices lower. Does frankincense do something to the brain? Medieval worshippers did not ask. They knew what the smoke did to a room. It softened edges, hid draughts, made beams of light into visible ladders, stitched the congregation into one breathing creature, as lungs matched the thurible swing. Priests fumigated altars and bodies with the same logic that governed medicine. Certain smells purify, certain vapors comfort the grief-heavy, certain resins ease the sick when carried to beds. If there is a drug here, it is discipline married to scent. Perfume threads into holy oil. Chrism, olive oil mixed with balsam, marks foreheads at baptism and confirmation, hands at ordination, walls at consecration. The nose learns before the mind does. This smell means beginnings, vows, new names. Balsam is costly and rare. Its sweetness lingers in hair and sleeves. You leave the service and strangers recognize the day on you. Perfumed oils do not make visions, but they cultivate memory. And memory is a low, steady intoxication that lasts longer than a cup. Outside the chancel, parish life is a procession of smaller rites where plants carry meaning and mild alteration together. Rosemary and juniper smoulder in braziers at funerals. Rue and yew are carried in procession on spring days that feel like a promise and a dare. Churches are strewn with rushes on feast days, strewn with herbs for weddings, strewn with clean hay when the old year needs to smell new. A woman ties a sprig of wormwood in a child's cap for protection. A verger crushes mint underfoot, and the nave answers with a bright note. No one confuses this with the soporific sponge. The point is not oblivion, but orientation. To belong to a parish is to live inside a choreography of faint influences you agree to. Hospitals founded by religious houses sit where church smell meets apothecary smell. And here the lines blur in ways that fed both faith and suspicion. A monk blesses a syrup because sick mouths need both sugar and courage. A sister adds poppy to a pectoral elixir for coughing and asks the priest to make a cross over the ladle. Christian Europe had no formal holy drugs, but it had holy containers and holy gestures, and those can sanctify a dose as surely as a prayer sanctifies bread. Pilgrims know this well. They carry away ampulli, little lead flasks, filled with oil from a lamp burned before a saint's tomb, or with water that washed a relic. Some of those waters are fortified with wine or herbs by the time they reach the cottage shelf. When a child spikes a fever, the mother moistens his lips with Thomas water or James oil, says a prayer, and waits. If the child settles, the house learns a lesson about grace conveyed by liquid, and the ampulla earns a permanent hook. We should not pretend that every medieval vision was herbal. Fasting, cold, grief, and long prayer will move a mind into strange neighborhoods, and some of the most careful visionaries, Hildegard of Bingen, for instance, left records of sights and sounds that owe more to illness and trance than to kitchen jars. Yet rumors of witches' salves and flying ointments gather in the later Middle Ages and early modern period, and their ingredients belong to gardens we already know. Henbane, belladonna, mandrake, datura in warmer lands. Mixed with fats and applied to skin, especially to thin, warm places where the body drinks deeply, they can make hours unfasten. Confessors and inquisitors later write about night rides, Sabbaths, lovers made from dreams. Modern readers argue about torture, suggestion, and pathology. What matters for our path is that the Church's worry about unauthorized ecstasy fell on top of a real pharmacology. Some plants, used boldly, can deliver a counterfeit of flight. The sanctioned route to rapture is chant. The unsanctioned is ointment. The distance between them, in the eyes of authority, is the distance between sacrament and sin. Not all debate ran toward fear. In the Islamic world, just beyond Christendom's line of sight, jurists argued in the 13th century about hashish. Some condemned it as a door to heedlessness. Others punished public use while shrugging at private relief. Still others distinguished pain-soothing from pleasure-seeking. Sufi poets and a few dervish orders became, in the imagination of their critics, people of the plant. Other Sufis rejected it outright and sought ecstasy in breath and whirling. The point is not to fold their story into ours, but to notice that medieval monotheisms shared a single puzzle. Can a substance help a soul toward God, or does it merely imitate the steps and leave the dancer worse than before? Christian councils condemned drunkenness with their Muslim neighbors. Jewish law blessed wine in Kiddush, while warning against excess. Across the Abrahamic field, ritualized drink had sacred standing. Intoxication outside ritual drew law like wasps to sweet. Jewish communities in medieval Europe turned wine into boundary and bridge at once. Sabbath entered the house on a cup. Wedding joy put wine under a canopy, to be broken afterward as a sharp memory folded into sweetness. 4 cups marked the Passover story so firmly that even the poor were commanded to drink if they could. Communal funds made it possible. The point was not stupor, it was shared telling. Yet here too, the body's chemistry made itself known. A festival day, a long fast broken, a second cup taken quickly. Someone swayed at the table, laughed louder, grew bolder than on a Tuesday. The rabbi's sermon the next week reminds the town that sacred and foolish share a border. Back in Christian sanctuaries, one finds small jars and little books that reveal how close religious and medicinal sat. Manuals for parish priests included recipes for holy water against fever, the water made from clean sources with a pinch of blessed salt, meant to be sipped. Collections of benedictions tell a priest how to bless bread and apples at harvest in ways that make them, in plain speech, more welcome to stomachs. Pilgrim shrines sold spirit waters, distillations steeped with herbs, prayed over, bought by those who trusted both copper still and saint. A woman keeps such a bottle for childbirth and draws on it for winter colds. If she gives a neighbor a spoon on a week with no illness, that is neighborhood rather than doctrine. But suspicion knows how to read overlaps. When a woman's remedies work too well, some men saw sorcery where a more careful eye might have seen good herbs and attention. The fear that drugs could interfere with sacrament had its own literature. Priests were warned not to approach the altar drunk, not to give communion to those stupefied, so that the mystery could not be reverently received. Manuals asked hard questions about the dying. Could a narcotic draught be given before confession if pain made speech impossible? The answers were situational. Try to hear the confession first, keep the mind clear if possible. But the answers reveal the looming ethical shape. Mercy has a cost when clarity is demanded. The same church that scented funerals with resin worried about the last cup a man took and what it did to his final words. At festivals, the line between sacred scent and merry intoxication blurred on purpose. Corpus Christi processed under a canopy through streets strewn with herbs. Parish ales raised money for roofs and candles. Saints' days came with mulled wine at the porch. To the reformer's ear, that looked like mixed motives. To a medieval parish, it looked like survival. Piety fed by cheer, because cheer kept piety housed. A church ale could turn rowdy, and the rector could scold on Sunday for what he had permitted on Saturday. The point is, the paradox was structural. Religion wanted your heart, the roof wanted your coin. Ale reached both. We can measure the ambition of medieval ritual by its stamina. Vigils ran late. Lent stacked fasts. Rogation processions walked fields and hedges praying crop prayers. People did not employ stimulants in the way later centuries did. Coffee had not yet arrived to draft monasteries into its empire of wakefulness. Pepper and spices played at the edges, warming stomachs and brightening senses. Cold and hunger softened vision. When the church promised an encounter with the holy, it built a path from the body up. Wash, wait, smell, listen, taste, kneel. If you are tempted to dismiss the method as mere manipulation, remember what manipulation is: the art of arranging a context so that a desired effect becomes likely. In a season of grief, manipulation is called comfort. On a feast day, it is called joy. A darker use of scent appears in exorcism and plague. Priests and lay healers burned herbs to clean the air. A theory underwritten by miasma and by the plain fact that bad rooms smelled bad. Rue, rosemary, laurel, juniper, planted at churchyards and boiled in cauldrons when the dead outnumbered the candles. Exorcists smoked rooms and bodies with resin, shouted names, pressed salts or relics to mouths. Medicine and miracle wore each other's clothes. A child who calmed under smoke seemed delivered. A fever that eased after fumigation obeyed the ritual. Skeptics, and there were always a few, shrugged and called it luck. Most people did not argue with the result. If the apothecary had a dark side, the church had its temptations too. To lean too hard on right over mercy. To scold drunks loudly and ignore pain quietly. To sanctify a smell and hold suspicion for the jar that provided real sleep. Yet the church also erected hospitals, gave shelter, blessed syrups, and taught generations to find consolation that did not require the second cup. You can hold both truths at once. Religion constrained intoxication and also gave it safe channels. It condemned stupefaction and also supplied a soft-edged room where the world could be faced more gently. Our hour in the nave ends where a different kind of knowledge begins. At the altar, the cup is held by a man under vow. In the lane outside, a woman under no vow, but to keep her children alive ties up bunches of herbs and knows when to say, "Only a thimble." The church wrote rubrics in red ink. She writes reminders on her palm. The next chapter belongs to her and to those like her, midwives, brewsters, healers at thresholds, whose command of plants could ease pain, summon sleep, or used boldly, tilt a mind into places the clergy did not trust. If priests managed the smoke inside stone, women managed the jars inside wood, and between those skill sets lay both cooperation and conflict. We follow the scent out the door and into kitchens and courtyards where knowledge wore aprons and sometimes accusations. Chapter 5. The Role of Women in Drug Use. We leave the nave's ordered weather, rubrics and incense, and step into rooms where knowledge wears aprons. Here the same herbs that churches bless and apothecaries weigh are pinched between floury fingers, steeped beside the stew, and carried in jars wrapped in cloth. In these kitchens and yards, women move between cradle and kettle, patient and pan, with an authority so ordinary it disappears until a crisis calls it by name. If the altar promised grace and the shop sold relief, the house turned both into survival. and the house, more often than not, answered to a woman. Start with the toolkit. A basket by the door holds sage, parsley, and fennel for dinner. Tucked beneath, pennyroyal, rue, tansy, juniper, savin, and yarrow wait for women's work. Emmenagogues to coax a late bleeding, bitter allies to nudge an unruly cycle back into rhythm. Plants some husbands pretend not to see. On the shelf, poppy heads drying upside down, a pouch of henbane wrapped tighter than the rest, lavender for pillows and linens, a twist of licorice root for cough, and a wedge of resinous myrrh bought dear at the fair. Beside them, ale and wine, the universal solvents, ready to carry sharp flavors into the body without a fight. These are not curiosities. They are the furniture of care in households that cannot afford a physician's visit, or where the nearest trained man lives a day's walk away. Midwives stand at the center of this quiet pharmacology. They know the smell of a labor going wrong and the weight of a pause that means the baby is turned. They know when heat and time will do more than any jar, and when a thimble of poppy syrup might buy a mother enough sleep to make it through a second night. They bind bellies, brew fennel tea to bring milk, and tuck a sprig of rue under a pillow when fear rattles the ribs worse than pain. They do not have our vocabulary for hormones or analgesics. They have recipes that work often enough to be remembered. When they reach for pennyroyal or tansy, they do so with a mix of compassion and calculation, aware that bringing on the courses can mean anything from easing cramps to ending a pregnancy that the household cannot survive. In the margins of medieval sermons, this makes them dangerous. In the margins of household budgets, it makes them indispensable. Brewsters, women who brew for home and sale, stand at another hinge where women, drugs, and daily life meet. Before beer becomes a capitalized industry, ale is kitchen work raised to a craft. Women mash, stir, and watch, adding small bundles of herbs, gruit, to flavor and preserve. Sweet gale, bog myrtle, yarrow, rosemary. Ale is food, pay, medicine, and balm. It carries possets to the sickbed and calories to the harvest field. A talented brewster builds a clientele by the cup and the gracious word, and she tastes constantly, testing for sourness, judging strength by scent and ear. Habit is part of the profession. To know ale as it changes is to drink it in sips all day. When neighbors say she keeps her own company too cheerfully, the guild officer shrugs. Without her, the lane runs on water. Apothecaries' shops, when the master dies, often pass into women's hands. Widows continue the trade because cities need continuity more than they need tidy categories. In the records, they are apothecariae, fined for short measure if caught, praised when inspectors find their syrups fresh and their scales honest. They know the recipes men copy from Avicenna and the school of Salerno. They also know which customers cannot tolerate a purge, which will oversleep if the henbane runs strong this year, and which will come back every Saturday for that cordial water, if they are allowed to put it on the slate. The ethical arithmetic in these interactions is gendered by circumstance rather than principle. A widow with 3 mouths to feed can be as stern as any guildsman about credit, and as soft as any neighbor about price when a child coughs like a broken bell. Between learned medicine and kitchen practice lies a set of books that tell you how porous the line is. The Trotula, a 12th century compendium on women's medicine associated with Salerno, moves from hygiene and beauty to conception, childbirth, and postpartum care with a matter-of-fact tone that assumes women's bodies deserve expertise. Whether its author or redactors were women is debated. That it gathered practical remedies alongside theory is not. Hildegard of Bingen writes about plants and temperaments with the same clarity she brings to visions. Later, laywomen copy collections of secreta mulierum, women's secrets, that mix sense and superstition, recipes that have travelled mouth to mouth longer than any ink has lasted. The point is not to romanticize female knowledge as always gentler or truer. It is to notice that a lot of medieval pharmacology lived in women's mouths and hands, whether or not a university noticed. Accusation walks this territory like a bailiff. When a sedative runs too strong and an old man does not wake, the whisper begins, poison. When a woman's brew brings on bleeding, the same word follows, dragging the heavier charge of maleficium, harm by hidden means. Poisoning is the crime that mirrors women's work. Domestic, intimate, administered in food and drink, hard to prove, easy to fear. Late medieval and early modern witch trials sharpen this fear into a machine. But even in our period the suspicion is ready. The woman who knows jars too well must be watched. Parish priests preach against witches' herbs. Town councils forbid the sale of certain substances without a physician's seal. When an apothecary's widow is hauled before a court, her defense is as much about reputation as recipe. Neighbors called to say she gave relief without asking reward. A priest vouching that she keeps the sacraments and her doors unlocked. Medicine, in women's hands, becomes a referendum on character. Yet those same hands keep families upright. Imagine a winter week when work does not come. The baby coughs, and the husband's temper snaps like a strap in frost. A woman measures sleep for the child in spoons, measures patience for the man in cups of small ale warmed with a clove if she can spare it, and measures her own nerves with a breath against lavender tucked in her sleeve. This is drug culture at the level of the house. Small, frequent choices about how much and when, under the pressure of money and reputation. A habit can start here without any Latin name. If sleep comes easiest when that syrup stands on the table learns to expect it. If a man is less cruel after 2 cups become a nightly truce, a mercy and a risk together. The church's disciplines land differently on women because their work intersects the body so intimately. Confessors ask about stupefaction, but a mother who gave poppy to a child so she could boil linen in peace refuses the word. She calls it quiet. She calls it saving the rest of the children from a night of screams. A midwife confesses a pennyroyal infusion and is told to fast. She does and returns to her rounds because abstaining from herbs will not pay for oil. Sermons against drunkenness catch alewives twice. Once for the customer's noise, again for the suspicion that women who sell drink must love it themselves. Some do. Many keep time with a sharper metronome than any moralist knows. The price of grain, the smell of the mash, the faces of men whose wages come across the counter disguised as cheer. Class carves up women's access to stronger stuff. Noble women can afford theriac and saffron, damask rose syrup, and a little lacquered casket of pearls ground into medicine when the physician says so. They keep recipe books where beauty chapters share pages with emetics, digestives, and soporifics. They can send a servant to the apothecary for the good poppy when their heads will not stop their pounding. Townswomen, wealthy merchants' wives, buy gentler syrups by the pound and hire midwives who know their way around both prayer and jar. Poorer women rely more directly on the hedge and the gossip of markets. Which stall sold tainted henbane last year? Whose tansy tastes strongest? Which Brewster's ale staves off hunger best for the price? In each bracket, addiction looks different. For the rich, it wears Latin labels and clean pewter. For the poor, it hangs from a hook in a brown bottle with string around the neck. Both can come to the spoon too often. Women's bodies are the testing ground for most of this pharmacology, and not only because of childbirth. Monthly cycles pregnancies wanted and unwanted, nursing, menopause. Each stage has its comforts and its rumours. A neighbour swears by yarrow for heavy bleeding, another by nettle, a third by a prayer to a local saint mixed with a sprinkle of salt in the bath. A widow teaches her niece the colours of urine to watch for after a tansy tea. An older midwife shakes her head at a new girl who reaches for savin juniper too quickly, warning that it burns inside. The knowledge here is empirical in the small, careful way that household empiricism always is. Try, observe, remember, teach. Failure is recorded in faces more than in books. There is, too, a gentler threshold where piety and scent meet that belongs to women in convents. Nuns keep still rooms, distill rosewater and balm, make syrups for the sick, and, in the process, inhale a life that many laywomen would recognize. Measuring, listening, dosing, praying over jars. They send bottles to town when plague bites. They give them free more often than city shops do, and earn stories in return. A nun who uses poppy circumspectly for a dying sister thinks of charity and of the rule. She does not think of addiction. A prioress who bans too much lavender on pillows does so because the younger sisters sleep through vigils, not because she fears a vice of lavender. If the convent smells like a garden turned library, that is because the women inside turn plants into memory and mercy every day. The dangers in women's drug work are not only chemical, they are legal and social. A husband who wants to be rid of a wife can call her a poisoner. A neighbour who lost a child can look for blame where grief needs it to land. A priest nervous about his flock's dependence on old women's tricks can preach with a pointed finger. Against this, women build reputations as carefully as they build syrups. Share, but not too freely. Help, but do not boast. Take a fair coin, but forgive a debt you can afford to forgive if it buys you a witness when trouble comes. In this moral economy, the ledger is written in favours and funerals as much as in money. And yet, alongside suspicion, there is a matter-of-fact respect. A midwife who has hands, the word people use when skill outruns explanation, is invited without argument. A brewster who never cheats measure need not hang an extra sign. An apothecary's widow who keeps her scales honest becomes part of the city's quiet machinery like a miller or a mason. Men come to them without fanfare, ashamed of fear or pain, and leave with bottles camouflaged as errands. If you are looking for where medieval drug culture actually lived, look here, under the shelf where onions dry, in the basket that swings on a woman's arm when she goes to market, in the folded paper where an older neighbour has written, in letters like fence posts, poppy, fennel, honey, warm, only a spoon. Dependency, when it arrives in these spaces, looks like a habit of coping that nobody would have dignified with a diagnostic word. A mother widowed at 35 takes 2 small cups each evening after the children sleep. She calls it turning the noise down. A weaver's daughter marries a man who hits less after he drinks. She learns to have a mug ready at the door at sundown and to keep a second mug for herself to still her hands. A midwife in her 40s finds she cannot fall asleep without the same syrup she kept for labours. She lies to herself about the measure until the bottle empties a day early. In each case, the line between care and capture is thin and walked daily. Women cross it alone more often than not, and when they stumble, there is no confessional category generous enough to hold what they were trying to do. Law and guilds shape the contour of women's work as markets expand. The same centuries that bring universities and learned medicine also bring tighter guild control over what counts as a profession. Brewing scales up. Men take more of the trade as capital and equipment grow. Apothecaries organize, physicians protect prescribing, surgeons claim cutting. Women continue in the interstices, household remedies, midwifery, small sales, widows' rights. But the space narrows. What was once what women do becomes, on paper, what women must not do without a man's license. Cities make exceptions because life requires them. Suspicion fills the gaps because power invites it. The story is not that women are pushed out entirely. It is that their expertise becomes less legible to the people who write laws. And still, the house persists. Even as caravans thread the east-west roads and ships bring saffron, pepper and opium to northern keys, the last hand to touch a dose before it enters a mouth is often a woman's. She stretches the foreign with the local, poppy with honey, saffron with rosewater, imported resin with hedge-grown balm, and teaches a child to swallow. She hears first when a remedy begins to own its user and asks, sometimes, the hardest question anyone asks in any century. Would you sleep tonight without it? If the answer is no, she measures anyway, because morning will need labor and a mind that can stand to face it. We have walked from altar to hearth, from public right to private rule, and found that much of medieval drug culture lives where women decide what a spoon means. Their choices made households bearable and sometimes turned houses into places of risk. Their knowledge steadied communities and sometimes called suspicion down upon their heads. To see the Middle Ages clearly, you have to see these jars, these hands, these ledgers written in favours. But the jars do not fill themselves. The next bend in our road leaves the lane and follows the routes that stock the shelves. River, road and sea, guild and fair, the long caravans that bring opium, sugar and spice to doors where women turn them into care. Trade changes not only what is possible to buy, but also how often a hand can reach for relief. And so we set out for the crossings, where merchants carry sleep in sacks and cities learn to want what only ships can bring. Chapter 6. The Dark Alchemy of Drug Addiction. We leave the women's kitchens, where jars mean mercy and rumour, by the back door and find, along the alley, another smell entirely. Vinegar that bites the throat, soot in the rafters, the sweet resinous edge of gums warming in a pan. Here the floor is sanded to catch spills, and the light comes in narrow, the sort of room where a fire is not a comfort, but a tool. Call it a laboratory if you like, though the word sits later on the tongue. In the later Middle Ages, it is a still room, a shop's back room, a monk's annex, places where heat and patience make substances change their nature. Relief is coaxed into smaller, stronger forms. Sleep is pressed into drops. Courage is clarified until it tastes like nothing and yet burns. Alchemy as craft and alchemy as metaphor fold together here. The same people who write about sulfur and mercury as the world's inner principles also keep notebooks on syrups and oils. The same hands that glaze pots with toxic greens grind opium into theriac. Lead turns into gold largely in hopes and diagrams, but pain does reliably turn into quiet, and that felt enough like magic to invite more. Addiction, not named, not theorized as a disease, emerges in this environment as the simplest of transmutations. A draught taken for a reason becomes a draught taken for itself. The crucible that makes the change is not clay, it is repetition. Distillation is the room's presiding trick. Heat a fermented liquid and it throws off a breath you can catch. Condense that breath against cool copper or clay, and you pour it as aquavitae, water of life. Physicians write about it with dignity, for the old, for the chilled, in drops for the failing, a stimulant for a heart grown thin. Apothecaries keep it in dark glass like a secret, and sell it in doses that look comically small to later eyes. Nobody yet drinks it by the cup. It tastes like medicine, not like company. But a habit hides even in small bottles. A clerk who cannot keep night vigil without a few warming drops learns exactly how many spur his tongue and how many set it galloping. A craftsman who takes aqua vitae for his winter cough learns that the cough obeys, and also that his hands feel brave enough to work an hour past dark. The bottle's neck is narrow. Time finds its way through anyway. Concentrations change more than strength. They change pace. Ale lulls, wine warms. Syrups take an hour to soften a chest. Distilled spirits and tinctures work like a hammer tap at the skull's door. Opium, that cold and dry substance learned from ancient books, enters medieval bodies as gum, as seeds, as paste. Pound it, steep it in wine, tie it into theriac with honey and myths, and it behaves predictably. Pain steps back, cough surrenders, sleep arrives. But if theric's honey dilutes the risk, tinctures undo the restraint. Opium dissolved into alcohol becomes less a paste and more a key. The person who learns this by accident finds the world rearranged. What took a spoon now takes a sip. What took patience now takes a swallow. Tolerance, the body's silent counter-argument, answers with its own logic. A spoonful that once calmed now only hushes. The hush that once lasted a night now gives 2 hours. Medieval writers call this nothing like tolerance. They call it assuetudo, custom, the body's habit, habitus, a settled disposition. The practical response is the same across centuries. Measure more. The shop's front room sells respectability, jars labelled in Latin, scales that kiss balance, recipes copied from authors who sound like law. The back room, when demand presses and the day is late, sells something else. Shortcuts. Syrups freshened with hotter wine. Pastes mixed to taste rather than text. Weeds that mimic dearer herbs when nobody is looking. And beyond shortcuts, there is ambition. The apothecary who can deliver sleep without heaviness, cheer without heat, courage without shame. That man owns his quarter. He experiments the way a cook does when a patron whispers foolish wishes. He knows henbane's edge, belladonna's long shadow, mandrake's steady hand. He is, for all his ledger's piety, an alchemist of moods. He is not alone. In monasteries where books and stills share walls, brothers write careful recipes for aqua benedicta, holy waters of their own devising, distilled with herbs to comfort the chest and the heart. They do not think of vice. They think of charity and craft. A monk who has lived through one winter plague feels an evangelical zeal about his pectoral elixir and sends vials to cottages the way a herald sends messages. Drink this. The elderflower is strong this year. Drop it into wine if you can afford it. Among those bottles, dependency is a rare sin, but not absent. A lay brother who works the night bell in the infirmary learns that 2 drops sharpen his will and 3 make the bell feel far away. He tells himself the extra was for God. In noble houses, alchemy sneaks in wearing silk. Ladies keep cabinets with syrups of rose and violet, jellies laced with poppy, cinnamon waters to lift a foggy head, and the most famous paste of all, theriac, aged and stamped. Physicians prescribe, ladies supervise compounds with a ruler's pride. The first spoon goes to a child who cannot settle. The third to the lady herself on nights when the court's politics feed sleeplessness like a wolf. She learns, because her body teaches her, that a spoon for comfort is not a sin, even if she wants it before she needs it. The vice that appears is domesticated, clean pewter, Latin names, a moral story about nerves rather than need. Her confessor asks about vanity and gossip. He does not ask about jars that carry Persian sleep into a French bedchamber. At the other end of town, the habit looks cheaper and no less elegant in its logic. A weaver in his 30s begins taking a poppy syrup at the day's end to quiet the twang between shoulder and spine, the ache that his wife calls the loom's tax. He wakes rested. The next week, he takes it after a quarrel too. The week after a burial. He does not call what is happening a spiral. He calls it prudence. What changes is not the bottle's label, but the rhythm of reach. On a Thursday, he takes it for nothing but a fretful heart, and for the first time he lies to his wife about the measure. That lie is the moment a historian with a pencil might circle. In his mind, it is only the necessary grease for a night that was frayed from the start. Charms about the philosopher's stone, promises of transmuted metals, of medicine that heals all, move between benches and courts like rumors do. They are, for most, a theatre of hope. But listen to alchemists when they write about the elixir vitae, the elixir of life, and you hear a different ambition. Not immortality as a number, but a life that feels less like a weight. One recipe promises an elixir that banishes melancholy and sharpens the heart spirit. Another pledges sleep free of phantasms. These are not metaphysical. They are sales pitches for bottles that begin as real restoratives and end as something else when the hand cannot stop returning. The search for the perfect elixir trains desire to believe in a next dose that will be the last for a while because it will be right. Those who chase that dose discover what every gambler knows. The right dose recedes when you walk toward it. Surgeons, bolder by necessity than most, become unwilling collaborators in this dark alchemy. To cut a tumor or set a bone in a world without modern anesthesia is to accept screaming as an instrument. And so, they deepen the soporific sponge, opium, mandrake, henbane, until it buys enough silence to work. The patients they save bring the practice back into households as recipes trimmed of terror. A cousin remembers that 3 pinches made her husband docile enough to endure a dislocation without striking. 2 pinches, then, might cure the ordinary night's awakenings. The slide from mercy to custom does not announce itself. It shows up a month later when the husband is angry without the pinches and weary with them, and nobody is sure which is sin. Merchants, for their part, carry temptation as diligently as they carry pepper. Trade routes that feed kitchens and guilds also stock the back rooms. Opium comes folded into spice bales because customs men understand cinnamon and pretend not to understand other resins. Sugar arrives in cones and makes bitter medicines bearable. Saffron lends glamour to paste that would otherwise taste like dirt. The bottle that holds a tincture would be useless without the leather that keeps it from shattering on the road. The cork came up a river and the glass down it. Dependence is a local experience built with imported parts. The debts that feed it are local too. Apothecaries extend credit to good customers. That generosity greases the slide from pennyworths on market day to put it on the slate, and then to I will pay when the fare comes, and no fare pays a craving. The law tries, in its clumsy way, to draw lines. Councils forbid the sale of certain narcotic herbs without a physician's paper. Guilds admonish members who keep stupefactions near the counter. Penitentials scold those who seek forgetfulness, a category that catches drunkards easily and catches sleepers when preachers feel brave. The best laws are practical. No jars without labels, no syrups past a certain age, no opium to the young without her father's consent. The worst are proud. Proclamations about purity that ignore the poverty that drives people to stores for mercies they can afford. The net result, as often, is a map of exceptions. A widow gets what a bachelor cannot. A noble steward leaves with what a mason could never touch. Black markets sprout like mushrooms toward the walls of statutes. Habit shows itself not only in measure, but in mood. Medieval medicine describes melancholia, a blackness of spirit that is bodily as much as moral. Some are born to it, others arrive after grief or fever. Remedies range from music to baths to purges to light, and among them, always, draughts that give a night's truce. When those draughts run out, melancholics present a picture any physician today would recognize. A weighted morning, a shiver, a mind that sits in a corner and gnaws itself. A household reads these signs as character. A shop reads them as likely customers. An apothecary with a conscience tries to steer toward milder herbs. His apprentice, sharper at commerce, learns which faces will come back even if you make the bottle smaller. If there is a literature of caution, it is not located in one book. It is scattered. A margin note in a chirurgery manual that says, "Beware too much sopor." A nun's letter that says, "Our sister X cannot keep vigils after the syrup." A confession record that lists sloth by potion as a sin the penitent invents to save face. Conversely, the literature of permission has 1,000 authors. The neighbor who says, "Take it, you look worn." The priest who decides sleep before Mass is less sinful than snoring during it. The surgeon who assures a mother that the black sleep is safe if she sees the whites of her husband's eyes. Between these sentences lies the world in which dependency grows. Half named, half denied, wholly practical. There are villains, of course, sellers who spike wines with soporifics and call them health drinks, and the occasional poisoner who uses the community's trust in jars as cover. They are loud in chronicles because chronicles prefer clean stories. The truer story is duller and heavier. Ordinary people solving ordinary pain with extraordinary plants until the plants teach the people a new ordinary. This is addiction without the sermon or the lecture. It has its own sacraments, measure, cork, spoon, and its own liturgy, promise, relief, remorse, repeat. A case to hold in mind. A mason injured his wrist when a lifting rope slipped on a wet morning. The surgeon set it and prescribed rest. The mason laughed. Work does not wait. Roofs must be finished before snow. The apothecary sold him a small bottle of poppy tincture for nights and, if necessary, for the hardest hours. The mason learned, as labourers do, to define necessary according to the weather and the master's mood. Winter passed, the wrist knit poorly, the bottle returned to the shelf. In spring, when the mason faced his first tall climb after the ice, he took 2 swallows at dawn and felt the height as a line on a wall rather than a drop into heaven. He told himself he would stop after that week. He did not. By harvest, he was borrowing against his wages. By All Saints, his wife hid the bottle, and he went to her sister's house, where the bottle stood on a ledge without a fight. No demon possessed him. No trauma speech explained him. He found a tool, and then found he could not put it back on the bench. The darker alchemy finally reveals itself as a loop. Transform pain into relief. Transform relief into need. Transform need into debt. Transform debt into more pain. You can break the loop, people do, by substituting gentler remedies, by tolerating more hurt, by leaning on neighbours instead of jars. Those options require luck, money, or patience. Medieval communities devised mutual aid habits that matter here. A parish might bring food and talk to a man everyone knew was drinking too much. A guild might fine a member for coming to work unsteady and collect the fine in labour rather than coin. A confessor might give penances that kept hands busy through difficult hours. None of this is treatment as a hospital would later conceive it, but all of it is a hedge. So why call it alchemy? Because the heart of alchemy is faith in transformations, base to noble, heavy to light, achieved by art. Addiction is that faith shadow. A person learns that a substance reliably transforms a bad hour into a bearable one and comes to believe that this art can be done without cost. The fire beneath the alembic is attention. The condenser is habit. The distillate is dependence. In treatises, alchemists are warned about false golds, glittering products that look right but fail the hammer. In life, the false gold is the good night that steals the next day. We end this hour where smoke and steam thin to air. The still is cool, the pestle rests, the page with today's measures dries in the ledger, and a drop that escaped the alembic has made a crescent damp mark on the wood. Behind the door, the city turns. Merchants argue over sacks. Sailors unload casks with stenciled marks. A boy runs with a note that will become a bottle by supper time. The road that brought opium and sugar here also brought other plants whose effects were more social than somatic. Pepper to make kitchens more ambitious. Saffron to flatter taste and purse. Trade did not invent dependence, but it increased the palette of moods available by the penny and the spoon. To understand how medieval drug culture thickened, we have to step onto those roads, sea lanes, river paths, caravan routes, and watch substances become common. Relief becomes commodity. Commodity becomes custom. Custom shapes lives. The next turn in our story follows the routes themselves and the markets they built, where merchants sold sleep by the ounce, and cities learned to want what only ships could bring. Chapter 7. The Social Consequences of Addiction. Morning comes to the town like a ledger opened. Pale light across the market stones, shutters tipped up, a bell tolling the first hour of work. On the bench outside the baker's, a man sits with his hat in his hands, staring at the steam rising from a cart of loaves as if heat alone could fatten him. He told his wife last night he would sell the spare cloak to pay the flour man. He told himself he would only have 1 cup at the tavern and a spoon of the syrup the apothecary promised would soothe his nerves. The cloak is gone. The flour man knocks anyway. The syrup bottle leans on the window ledge like a small, honest lie. We have spent 6 chapters watching draughts and powders pass from gardens and counters into mouths. Now we watch what those cups do to houses and streets. Start inside the door most people walk through each day. The household. In a world where a family's survival depends on a thin margin of good weather and steady hands, relief is not a luxury. A spoon that buys a night's sleep buys labor today. A cup that unknots the shoulders buys enough patience for a week with bad news. Yet the arithmetic of mercy slides. A mother who measures Poppy into a child's spoon only when he coughs like a broken bell begins measuring on long evenings when laundry and fear have knotted her. She calls it her right, then she calls it necessary, then she hides the bottle because saying nothing feels easier than naming the measure. A father, set in his back by years at the loom, discovers that 2 cups make him gentler and 4 cups make him cruel. The house learns to balance upon a thin, wet line it cannot afford to cross. Children feel the geography first. They are the ones who know which floorboards creak and which voice at the door announces a safe night. A son learns to keep an eye on the jar and on the man who reaches for it. A daughter learns to count coins and to lie cheerfully to the baker. The flour will be paid at Martinmas, with a skill that changes her posture. The oldest eats last. The baby cries longer. The middle child steals honey from the shelf because sweetness becomes a map that tells him where the warm rooms are. In a parish that runs on reputation, a household slide is marked less in loud tragedies than in quiet substitutions. Meat becomes broth. Broth becomes bread crusts soaked in ale. Ale becomes the only thing no creditor can stop you swallowing. Work bends next. Guilds and manorial courts knew the tinctures and the strong ales as well as any household did, and they set rules to keep them outside the workday. A joiner fined for coming to the bench unsteady. A mason warned that the next wobble on a scaffold will cost him not coin but the job. An apprentice whose master writes in the guild book that the lad keeps a soft head and must be watched. These records sound like scolding, and sometimes they are. As often they are the city trying to protect itself from the most expensive consequence of dependence, lost labour. A town's wealth is made of hours joined cleverly. Addiction unpicks stitches. Fines are more than moral gestures. They are attempts to make the cost visible sooner than the hunger does. Credit, that quiet engine of medieval life, turns with new teeth when addiction enters the account. Taverns carry small ledgers. Apothecaries keep bigger ones. Pawnbrokers, the Lombards with their 3 golden balls, stack pledges behind screens in the back. A cloak, a knife, a copper pot, a wedding belt. Each item becomes a comma in a longer sentence that ends too often with an empty shelf. Credit is how a good month carries a bad one. It is also how a habit hides from daylight. Put it on the slate, says the mouth that will not admit, I cannot stop. Slates wipe clean at the fair if the debtor is lucky. Without luck, a man stands in the market with his name read out, and a constable leads him to the stocks, where children throw apple cores, and the parish registers the small roar of collective relief. Not me, not today. Parish, guild and court each claim a piece of the problem. The parish priests hear confessions about drink and stupefaction, and hand out penances that are, in their way, behavioural nudges. Fast on Wednesdays. Avoid the tavern of such and such. Give alms to the hospital for a month instead of buying spiced wine at the porch on feast days. The guilds write rules that treat intoxication as a breach of craft itself. A weaver who knots his thread with a shaking hand not only cheats his customer, he drags the trade's name through mud. Manorial and municipal courts, less interested in souls than in order, punish brawls, noise, broken windows, and broken promises. Here the costs grow public. A woman stands in court and lists the bruises under her coif. A man stands and lists the months unpaid on a cottage. Neither says addiction. They say drink, or bad temper, or softness, or that syrup from the shop. To see how a city absorbs those costs, walk to its charitable edge. The hospital, Hôtel Dieu in Paris, a Lazare house outside the walls, an almshouse built by a guild, was not a treatment centre in any modern sense, but it was a safety net woven from vows. The infirmary gives shelter to those who have no bed, food to those who have slipped off the rope of work, gentle draughts to those whose nerves will not settle. Monks and sisters do not spend time naming a disease they cannot cure. They manage a recurring ache in their town. They temper jars with prayer and put distance between addicts and the places that tempt them. Distance made of a wall, a bell, a rule. If some return again and again, the ledger notes it with a dot next to a name. Every community has its dot trail. Confraternities and parish guilds, the lay brotherhoods built for piety and mutual aid, push the net closer to the street. A group of fishmongers promises to bury any member found fallen by mischance, and to bring bread to his wife for a month. A group of women dedicated to Our Lady of Pity meets to sew shrouds and in the same breath to take up a small purse for families who have lost a week's wage to a bench fight. These organizations do not announce themselves as temperance societies. They behave like what they are. Nets stretched under a town that knows how precarious standing upright can be. The same men who drink together after a funeral will walk with candles in the night when a neighbour's home is judged troubled and stay until dawn to outlast the bottle. Shame and honour do part of the town's work. Medieval law runs on farmer reputation. To bring a suit, you often need to show that people talk. To defend yourself, you show that people talk well. Addiction eats farmer quickly. The woman whose husband has become that sort of man learns to barter on the strength of her own name. Sell to me, I have never cheated you, and to borrow neighbour women's faces when hers won't open doors. Reputation can be mended, but it mends slowly, and addiction moves quickly, faster than mending threads. The stocks and the pillory, crude instruments, have a social logic. Humiliation is meant to cauterize habit with public heat. It rarely does, but it does remind the town that it has agreed upon limits, and sometimes the man in the stocks hears the limits in a way he could not hear them at home. Violence comes into the house with dependence more easily than sermons admit. A cup too many, a syrup too often, and the ordinary frictions of cramped living, money, sex, jealousy, work undone, find an edge. Medieval records list a phrase and assaults, without the psychological footnotes we would add. They record injuries, not causes. Read across the lines, and you see the pattern. Sabbath evenings, paydays, feasts, wakes. The same calendar that knits a parish together loosens its joints. Festivity is both glue and solvent. Women bear the double weight. Suspicion if they sell ale. Danger if a man returns raw from a bench. Parish discipline punishes loud wives. It punishes loud husbands too, but less efficiently, because a humiliated man becomes often a harder man. The poorhouse and the church porch witness another consequence: neglect. When a habit grows, care shrinks. Infants sleep in damp. Elders lie in their own breath too long. A disabled uncle stops being turned in his bed. Neglect is rarely plotted. It grows when days shorten and spoons lengthen. Almsgivers and church wardens notice it in smells and in the way eyes look away. They deliver wood and bread. They bring a priest. They gossip with purpose. Charity in the Middle Ages is not a gentle profession. It is a practice of controlled interference. We visited, we saw, we demanded the bottle. Sometimes it works, often it postpones the drop. Meanwhile, the line outside the poor box draws a map of the drug's footprint in coin and hunger. Crime ties itself to dependence like ivy to a wall. Theft of small items rises when a bottle matters more than a pot. Fences, those who buy stolen goods, are often the same men who sell strong drink. City statutes reflect this knowledge obliquely. Curfews for taverns, bans on serving after compline, restrictions on hot wines laced with stupefying herbs. Even so, a hand goes through a window for a loaf. A stall is snipped for a leather strap that will fetch 2 pennies at the pawn. Chronicles love grand poisonings and the apothecary who sells death. The daybook of a constable loves the mundane. A boy caught with a knife that isn't his. A woman who swears she found the cup by the river. Dependence here is cause and pretext both. It does not excuse the deed, but it explains the steady noise of petty loss that a medieval town learns to hear like weather. Not all consequences live below the eaves. Nobles and courtiers wear their habits in brocade. A lord who drinks too deep shames himself at the hunt and breaks a horse. A lady who leans on Theriac to cross a winter of court politics grows pale and private. Delaying audiences, acquiring a reputation for nerves that shifts her standing in rooms where alliances are made. Here the consequences are not lost wages, but lost influence. A weak hand cannot gather retainers. A mistress who sleeps too deeply cannot shape a rumour. Chronicles give such people kinder names: melancholic, delicate, until they turn cruel and then give them blacker ones. Rank cushions the fall, but it does not remove it. It merely changes what breaks. Religion tightens and loosens in response. Sermons grow sharper during famine and plague, when the town can least afford either riot or stupor. Priests admonish against seeking forgetfulness. They also decide one by one to give absolution that recognizes the way bodies fold under weight. The same church that condemns drunkenness blesses convalescence with spiced wine and allows small ale to the sick on fast days. The contradiction is real only to those who do not live in bodies. To the poor, the church smells like possibility and reproach at once. Smoke and honey, yes, also rules. Some walk away from rules toward tavern benches that do not talk back. Some walk into rules and find stricter help. The discipline of confraternities, the steadier friendship of men who believe you when you say you will keep to 2 cups. Communities invent informal therapies. A carpenter's mates take turns walking him home before sunset for a month, telling stories at his door until his hands stop twitching toward the lane. A midwife recruits the women of her street to share night watches with a mother who gives too much syrup to her infant so she can sleep without the jar. A shopkeeper, himself a man who survived a season of heavy cups, offers easy work sweeping at dawn in exchange for breakfast to those who look worst in the morning. He calls it charity, then he calls it good business, then he stops calling it anything and simply leaves the broom by the door. There is no program here, only habits of intercession that emerge in quarters where everyone knows the smell of trouble as soon as the latch lifts. Town governments tinker with the supply side. Some forbid apothecaries to sell narcotic herbs without a physician's mark. Some set hours for taverns and levy fines on sellers of hot wine and stupefying ales. Officials test measures and strengths. They confiscate syrups past their year. These measures do not abolish dependence. They make it less convenient. Convenience is not a small matter. A habit turned back by a locked door sometimes fails to seek a second. More often, it learns the new door's hours. The most effective interventions remain the ones that feel like custom. Guild rules you cannot avoid. Neighbors who expect you at work. A choir that expects your voice at compline. A wife whose silence is worse than a scold. Gender runs through all of this like a stubborn thread. Women who brew or sell drink risk their living every time a brawl begins near their bench. Women who dispense household remedies become the first accused when a dose goes wrong. At the same time, women absorb the blow of addiction most directly. They juggle coins, feed children early and husbands late, clean blood and vomit, lie with quick skill to creditors and slow grief to themselves. Men bear the public punishments, stocks, fines, the workshop's contempt. Women bear the private punishments that fill no ledger. A daughter who will not marry because the neighborhood knows her house. A son who apprentices poorly because mistrust trails him like smoke. The medieval city is not blind to this. It simply lacks a way to speak compassion at scale. The compassion it finds is parochial. This street, these women, this winter. And then come the poor who are strangers, throwing into relief how dependence and mobility multiply harm. A pilgrim who lost his purse too often on the road and learned to beg with a charming story, now arrives with a thirst he cannot hide. A veteran who learned to dull terror with cups comes home to an empty holding and an in need of repair body, and finds that the town has patience for stories of glory, but less for the man who shakes. Vagrancy statutes at the very end of our period will begin to bite these people hard. Before that, there is still a weather vane of mercy. A friendly parish may fold them in with bread and work, An unfriendly one may drive them out with staves toward the next jurisdiction. Dependence loves movement. Movement sheds reputation. Without farmer, only the church porch and the road remain. If dependence is a private transmutation, pain to relief to need, its social transmutation is debt into disorder. Disorder is expensive. A broken window and a broken jaw keep two men from work. A family pitched from a cottage for unpaid rent becomes 3 new supplicants at the arm's chest. A brawl fought with knives rather than fists creates widows and orphans whose care spreads like spilled ale under a door. Town accounts tell the story without using the word. Extra constables hired at midsummer. Repairs to the stocks. Bread purchased for the jail. Candles for a vigil held after a fight turned mortal. The ledger's hands shake a little at those entries. A city clerk is a person like anyone else, and yet, if you only count costs, you miss the way communities change themselves to hold what hurts them. Parish ales, so often scolded, keep roofs on naves where men go to swear off their 3rd cup. Guild feasts, so often rowdy, bind apprentices to masters who will one day stand at their doors to walk them past the tavern. Even the apothecary, with his jars fit for reproach, learns in time to slyly dilute a syrup for a customer whose face tells the truth, and to whisper when the shop is empty. Try this instead. It works slower, but it will not hold you so tightly. These are not victories in the triumphant sense. They are adjustments, like a body that learns to lean on the sound leg. If we end the chapter outside again, it is because the street keeps the score. Men go to work or they don't. Women carry baskets or they don't. Children hang about stoves or run to school or the fields. A bell rings for a funeral at the hospital, and a bell rings for a wedding at the parish, and the same crowd, mostly, attends both, because habit is communal. Addiction's consequences are not solely the drunkard in the stocks. They are the long day afterward when a workshop runs short-handed and a child eats less, and the church wardens argue about the poor box. The marvel is that the town, most days, still runs. The pity is the cost at which it does. We could end here, with the house and the street and the ledger. But the Middle Ages knows a harsher laboratory than the apothecary's back room or the tavern bench, the field of war. There, dependency finds both excuse and accelerant. Cups to steady hands before a charge, draughts to close eyes after horrors, bottles to silence the memory that arrived home wearing a soldier's boots. The next hour walks into that weather, tents and ration lines, discipline and desertion, to see how armies borrow from the same jars as cities, and how the price of numbness is counted in more than coins. Chapter 8. Conclusion. The market has emptied, the tavern shutters are up, and the apothecary has snuffed his lamp. The town lies at that thin hour when a city's breath goes shallow. We've walked its whole circuit, garden to shop, bench to nave, kitchen to stillroom, ledger to stocks, and watched cups and spoons move through hands that wanted the same few things we do. Pain eased, sleep found, courage raised, grief lowered. If you strip away our modern labels, the medieval story of drugs and addiction is not a preface to real history. It is the operating manual for a society that had to carry pain without anesthesia and fear without therapy. Its legacies are sturdier than they look. First, the spoon. Medieval people intuited what later physicians wrote down. Strength is a virtue and a threat in the same dose. They didn't speak Paracelsus's famous line, "The dose makes the poison." But their ledgers and margins say it under other names. Beware too much sopor, for robust bodies only. Keep the mind clear for confession. This is the oldest inheritance, an ethics of dosing. Behind every jar stood a judgment. Enough to work, not so much you cannot speak. Enough to sleep, not so much you cannot wake. That moral math, how far relief may go before it becomes a theft, still governs clinics, kitchens and laws. Second, the profession. The apothecary is ancestor to our pharmacist and our regulator at once. Guild rules, stamped theriac, public compounding, ale tasters with legal bite. These were early forms of quality control and consumer protection. Were they perfect? No. But they made purity, potency and price matters of civic concern, not private charm. Our modern pharmacopoeias, inspectors and black box warnings are upgrades of that instinct. Even the showmanship around theriac, the ceremony, the seal, the price, prefigures the modern blend of science and branding that sells relief as much with trust as with chemistry. Third, the household and women. Much of medieval drug culture lived in women's hands. Midwives dosing courage and sleep. Brewsters balancing calories and comfort. Widows running shops between charity and caution. That feminized labor of care, indispensable, underpaid, publicly suspect, has a long shadow. We still rely on unpaid or underpaid domestic pharmacology, from kitchen remedies to managing prescriptions, and we still blame women first when a dose goes wrong. The medieval script, expertise trusted until it threatens a man's control, reappears wherever caregiving and authority collide. Fourth, ritual. The church did not cause intoxication. It ritualized the senses to aim the heart. A measured sip of wine, the hum of chant, the narcotic softness of incense. These taught a culture to seek altered states under rules. That is not so far from how we legislate the rest. Alcohol legal in frames, cannabis legal in others, morphine available under signatures and keys. Medieval people knew two powerful truths we still wrestle with. Ecstasy melts into error when it refuses supervision, and prohibition without consolation is a brittle law. Fifth, the language. The Middle Ages did not have addiction as a disease model. They had sin, softness, bad habit, acedia. Yet stigma and sympathy already wrestled on the same bench. A drunkard was mocked in public and fed in private. A chronic user was scolded in confession and spared at the hospital. Our own vocabulary, substance use disorder, harm reduction, relapse, changes the framing, but not the tug-of-war between judgment and mercy. We inherit their ambivalence. We want accountability and we want relief, and we rarely get a clean blend. Sixth, the supply chain. Medieval trade did not invent desire. It multiplied its options. Opium rode with spices. Sugar made bitterness gentle. Glass and cork made storage easier. Hops extended shelf life. And long-distance credit let habits outrun wages. The result was a wider, cheaper, steadier access to altered states. That is the modern story too. Global supply meets local pain, and the price of available is paid in neighborhoods first. If a 13th century port inspector squints at a bale that smells like sleep, you can see the prehistory of every customs seizure and every argument about interdiction versus treatment. Seventh, community responses. The medieval city was not naive. It fined drunk craftsmen, limited tavern hours, tested measures, banned certain sales without a physician's note. It also backed hospitals, confraternities, parish chests, and practical kindness. A broom at dawn, a bed for a bad night, a diluted bottle slipped across the counter when a face told the truth. None of that cured dependence, but it made relapse survivable and made recovery conceivable. If you're looking for the roots of harm reduction, look at a guild that walks a member home, or an apothecary who waters a syrup on purpose. Eighth, the ledger. Addiction's social footprint was counted in coin, hours and bones. Wages missed, tools pawned, benches short-handed, windows broken, marriages frayed. Municipal books note extra constables at midsummer, bread for the jail, repairs to stocks, costs of numbness carried by everyone. That is the hard continuity, the bill for relief, whether narcotics, alcohol, or anything stronger or subtler, rarely stops at the hand that holds the cup. A town has to decide always how much of that bill it will pay in pity, in punishment, in policy. Ninth, the body. Without a word for dependence, people still felt its physics. Tolerance rising like a flood, mornings stripped down to nerve, a brain that needed what a bottle had taught it to expect. They described it as melancholy, sloth, weakness, a soft head. We describe receptors and withdrawals. Both descriptions point to the same human fact. Repetition changes us. The medieval answer: build customs that aim desire towards safer channels, then keep watch at the edges, remains useful in a century that keeps inventing faster keys for the same locks. Finally, the story. Chronicles dramatize poison and vice. The truth was mostly mundane and therefore stubborn. Relief became routine. Routine became reliance. Reliance became debt and disorder in some houses, and in others it stayed what it began as: mercy carefully measured. That split outcome is not a narrative flaw. It is the terrain. Medieval people learned to live on it with rules, jokes, prayers, fines and favors. We have more chemistry and more policy. We do not have a different species of heart. So what lasts? The objects, for one. The spoon, the cup, the sealed jar, the stamped paste, the scale that can be honest or sly. The institutions, for another. The inspected shop, the regulated bench, the parish that both condemns and feeds, the hospital that does not ask too many questions before it finds you a bed. And the questions, stubborn as ever. How much relief can a person use before the relief starts using the person? Who decides? A priest, a physician, a guild, a neighbor, a law. Who pays when the measure slips? The household, the street, the city. And what replaces the cup if we ask someone to put it down? If this series has done its work, it has replaced the flat image of drunken peasants with a crowded map. Learned doctors measuring strong sleep with cold hands. Women folding courage into teas and possets. Merchants importing quiet by the bale. Priests fumigating despair. Guilds tightening the lid on a workday. Neighbors keeping vigil at a door. Addiction in the Middle Ages wasn't an exotic medieval vice. It was the ordinary consequence of ordinary relief in a world that needed relief constantly. The final scene is quiet. A monk in an infirmary weighs a dose and hesitates. Kindness versus clarity. An apothecary wipes his scale and decides to shave a debt. A brewster waters her last batch because grain ran thin and winter isn't done. A mother taps a spoon against a bottle and counts backward from 5. A clerk passes a tavern and keeps walking, just this once, because his friend is waiting at the workshop and because shame and hope can sometimes pull together. The bell rings the town to compline, and the smoke rises in measured arcs, and sleep, earned, dosed or prayed for, visits as it always has, by degrees. The Middle Ages did not solve addiction. They taught, by trial and habit, how to live with powerful substances in a fragile world. Regulate what you can. Ritualize what you must. Help your neighbor. Mind the dose. Expect the bill. Forgive where possible. We inherit their problems and their strategies both. The names on our bottles have changed. The hands on our spoons have not. Thanks for watching and walking this road with me. If this journey through medieval drug culture gave you something to think about, I'm glad you were here. Until next time, take care.